you for that introduction, Helen. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Helen's given you a brief outline already of what we're going to cover this morning, but just so that you're aware of the main components, as you said, we'll talk a bit about board decisions to begin with, and then creating the climate within which good decisions can be made, and then I'll break for questions. Then I'll go on to talking about various structured approaches to decision making in the boardroom, and finish the session reviewing a range of ways in which the quality of boardroom decision making might be able to be improved. I have to say that when I sat down to prepare this webinar, I found that I could have spent all day talking about it, so I've had to be quite brutal in terms of what I have included and what I've excluded. But I'd be very happy at some later time, if anyone wants to contact me, to give you some more material or lead you in the direction of things that you might be interested in. Can I just also, Helen mentioned the Getting on Board document. You'll find that useful in various ways in relation to the topic today, and also previous webinars. Some of them have dealt with some of the matters which do have a bearing on decision making, like board dynamics, for example. Can I just make some general comments to begin with? Firstly, that at the heart of any board's work is making the choices that shape for good or ill an organisation's future. I'd also say that boardroom decision making is not simply the sum of the private individualised thinking of its members. It should be, or it is, or it should be, highly interactive and synergistic. Many of the challenges in boardroom decision making come from the collaborative process of board members thinking together, both with other board members and with staff, and then with the collective accountability for what results from that process. I think it's also important to take into account that decision making in the boardroom has both a generative and a protective component. For example, good decisions about strategy and products or services can move an organisation to the next performance level. But equally, if risks affecting an organisation are not understood and well managed, the organisation may well cease to even exist. Unfortunately, and certainly in my personal experience, preparation for making good group decisions is rare. Even if we have been taught as individuals to think critically and to make good decisions for ourselves, very few of us have had the opportunity to learn to make decisions in a group environment. So let's talk about board decisions. Which decisions should a board make? How should they make them? And when should they make them? So it's important in terms of which decisions to know that we're starting with some formal reference points. So obviously the constitution of the organisation, or rules if you're an incorporated society, these determine which powers are retained by the members or the owners of the organisation and which are delegated to the board. Now, apart from changes to the constitution, the determination of the closure of the organisation potentially, and appointments to the board, mostly decision-making authority resides with the board. But then the board has to decide how much of its decision-making authority it is going to delegate to others. Now that could be to the chair of the board, or it could be to committees of the board, or in all likelihood, a majority of certainly the day-to-day decision-making will be delegated to the principal officer of the organisation, the person that I've called here the Chief Executive Officer. Then another thing that's very relevant to which decisions are the plans that an organisation has adopted, and certainly the plans that have been adopted at the board level. So when we're looking at making board level decisions, they should be framed by those plans. They should be relevant to those plans. And if the decision is not relevant to the implementation of, say, the strategic plan, why not? In terms of how should the board make decisions, there's a whole bunch of things that I think are relevant there too. And I haven't included it on the slide, but the Constitution continues to be relevant in terms of how, because It may deal with issues such as, for example, does the chair of the board have a casting vote? What is the quorum for a board? How many members need to be present before a decision can be made? Do meetings have to be held face-to-face, for example, or could they be held in some other fashions, by teleconference or what have you? But policy making, we've talked about in earlier workshops or earlier webinars, a very significant process for the board, because the way in which the board achieves remote control over everything that happens in the organisation. So the board's policy and any stated values, although sometimes the values are just implicit in the board's policies, they should be the starting point for any decision that the board makes, because that is the statement that the board has made ahead of time about what's important. So the policies also create a control system, in a sense, because then it's about decisions and actions in the organisation being in compliance with policy. But the existence of good governance policy means that actually a board doesn't have to make many decisions. Predominantly, its decision making is about policy, and then it's delegating decisions to others to be taken within that policy framework. And the only need for the board to become involved in decisions is when things are difficult, when they're not framed by policy already, or the risk is such that it's a decision that's beyond the sort of risks that you should expect staff to take. Protocols are also important because sometimes boards have quite specific and codified pronouncements on, for example, how decisions should be made. Sometimes it's just, this is philosophical, for example, are we going to be a board that's going to vote on everything in a very formal parliamentary sort of way, or are we going to be a board that strives for consensus decision making? And so there's a behavioural component to that. The board may have also decided ahead of time, either in a general sense or in relation to a specific decision that's coming up, what its decision-making criteria should be. And a really simple example of that would be determining if it was looking to recruit a new chief executive, what is the sort of person spec, the sort of profile, the sort of capabilities, experience that they're looking to recruit into the role. And that should frame and be the reference point for the board's selection of a new chief executive. I've also referred to norms because norms are those sort of unofficial rules that have never probably even been acknowledged, but they actually guide whether or not a decision is made in a particular way. And so, for example, norms might even cut across explicit and codified expectations. A recent example I was involved in looking at was where a board had formally delegated a whole bunch of decisions to the chief executive, but actually the norm that was in place was that the chief executive should still ask the board for permission in relation to those things. When should a board make decisions is the next question. So there's a number of factors that can influence when that might occur. The first one really is maybe there are statutory deadlines or contractual deadlines as to when a particular decision might need to be made. Does the board have an annual agenda or work plan that has been developed so that decisions are made at an appropriate point within the board's calendar? And is it in a sensible sequence in relation to other decisions that the board must make? When is the best time within a given board meeting to make an important decision? And that's a simple answer for that question. It's really as early as possible, when there's no or there's less time pressure and when people's heads are relatively clear. Even the time of day can be quite important. For example, something I've been studying recently is an emerging field of science around what's called decision fatigue. And again, everything points there to decisions, important decisions, whether at a personal or board level, being made as early in the day as possible. And is it the right time? I'm sure we've all experienced the situation where it's been difficult to make a decision, and the decision for various reasons has been parked, and then maybe 6 or 12 months later when it's revisited, the decision's really easy because it was too soon previously. People just hadn't got their heads around an issue, or there were impediments that have subsequently been removed. I think the critical thing, though, in relation to timing is just to make sure that wherever possible, the board has enough time to really think things through. So, creating the right climate for effective boardroom decision making. The environment has quite a significant part to play. And, you know, these days technology has created alternatives to face-to-face meetings, and we need to remember that 75%, according to some experts, of communication between individuals is by visual cues. So ideally board meetings should be made in a face-to-face manner, although I appreciate, and it's certainly common amongst national organisations in the not-for-profit environment, that boards frequently have various forms of online or teleconference type meetings as a substitute for the expense of meeting face-to-face. But let's assume a face-to-face meeting is being held. Does the physical environment for the meeting support a good decision-making process? And there's a lot of variables here. So location is one, and that relates to accessibility to members. You know, can they all get to that place in a reasonable fashion? Is the location expensive? Do you have to hire a meeting place, for example? Is there any particular symbolism attached to where the board meets? Is it a convenient location in other respects? And is it comfortable? And another thing we might even include is does it support the board being focused on the task at hand? You know, is there an absence of distractions? The room itself is also important. So ideally what we want to be looking at is a board meeting room where the room can be set up so that members of the board are visible to each other, and that the way and where they're sitting enables them to feel included in the group. So the table shape and the seating arrangements become quite significant in that regard. So the optimal table for a board meeting is circular because it optimizes eye contact between each of its members, and it also minimizes the physical distance between each of the participants. Another factor is where does the chair sit? You know, the traditional board meeting table is long and narrow, and the chair tends to sit at the head of that table, which removes them physically from those who are furthest away. Ideally, if you have got a long table, the best place for the chair to sit is in the middle of the longest side. And then another thing that perhaps arises from board dynamics and the relationships between people in the board is where do people sit relative to each other? You know, do you sit with somebody you know really well? And does that encourage little side conversations that might be disruptive to the meeting? And the other thing that I would refer to, which I think is very important, particularly for longer meetings, is the room naturally lit, or is it one of these terrible internal rooms that sometimes we find in hotels and other meeting places that we meet for workshops and the like, where really you're closed off from that natural environment and natural light. An obvious one that I haven't referred to yet is the temperature of the room as well. So those physical features can actually have a significant impact on whether the board is able to be relaxed and comfortable and in a good decision-making sort of mode. So don't neglect to deal with those things if you possibly have some control over the physical environment. Next thing I want to refer to is whether or not we have the people that we need at the meeting. Are the right people involved? And there's some key questions here. So the first one then being, who has the information that the board needs in order to make an effective decision? And that might not just be the board members, or it might not be even the board members or even the staff. It may be that others, professional advisors, for example, need to come into that meeting space for the duration of that decision-making process, or at least part of it. Another really important issue is who has to implement the decision. So, for example, I've been involved just in the last few weeks in helping a board review its effectiveness. And one of the issues that's arisen there is whether or not there are too many members of the management team sitting in the board meeting, which actually turns out has made some of the board members feel somewhat inhibited in terms of the sort of issues that they would want to raise in relation to a particular decision. But on the other hand, it's really important for staff who are going to be implementing a decision to actually understand the board's thought processes and how they've come to a particular decision. The board composition is also very important in itself. It's a pretty fundamental issue, but, you know, to use a bit of vernacular, does the board have sufficient grunt to deal with the sort of situations that it's having to confront, the kind of decisions that it's having to deal with? So does it have the collective intelligence, the industry, if I can call it industry, knowledge of the way the sort of organisation that it's governing works, how people are motivated, for example? Does the board have sufficient connections through their own networks into other important dimensions of the decision in terms of understanding, perhaps, for example, what stakeholder interests might be relevant to that decision? Can the board members themselves commit sufficient time and energy to actually due process to ensure that the decision is properly thought through, or is it something that because of their other commitments they really can't put the time and effort into studying the issue satisfactorily and to spending the time with the board and with others perhaps to think the issues through? And I suppose related to that is board members' own motivation and their level of interest in the matters at hand. Staff participation I just hinted at before, but it is a question that needs to be addressed. So which members of staff should be involved directly in when the board is in decision-making mode? How many of them need to be there? When do they need to be there? Do they need to be there the whole time, or will they just come in and give advice on specific dimensions of the decision that's being considered? Advisors, I touched on before, they can be very important in relation to a particular issue. For example, legal advisors or financial advisors, or advisors who have a particular knowledge about a market that you're looking at, or a particular art form, or whatever it might be that's pertinent to the final decision. And I touched also on stakeholders before, but you know, boards don't exist in an ivory tower, and quite often decisions become quite difficult, particularly difficult to implement if they haven't been socialised or worked through or consulted about with stakeholders who are going to be affected by those decisions. And I think, you know, we can see those sorts of things referred to in the paper every day. I'm just thinking about the debate in Auckland about housing density, for example. And it's not inappropriate to involve stakeholders in board meetings where there is some particular gain to be made from that. Next question for me is, does the board culture support good decision making? The board culture, and I've referred to norms before, which is sort of part of the broader assessment of what the board culture is, the way things get done here. Do they support good decision making? For example, does the board culture encourage its members to be open and honest with each other, or do they sit on their hands during the discussion at the board meeting, and then you see them out in the car park afterwards in little cliques bitching and moaning about what the board did or didn't decide. Does the culture encourage the full engagement of individual board members, or does it support a sort of a passive-aggressive type of behaviour? Is the board and the staff, for that matter, able to rely on people's retention of confidences where aspects of the decision-making process may need to be confidential for some reason? That goes to the heart of whether there's mutual trust and confidence within the board and between the board and the staff. And where boards are unable to maintain that sort of level of confidentiality, it can really undermine the quality of the decision-making process. Another factor in board culture might be whether or not there's some sort of fear factor in the board. Are some members reluctant to speak because of the way they fear that other board members may react to things that they're saying? And the same thing applies between board and staff. Another thing I'd highlight is whether or not there's effective facilitation of the group process. The chair has a really important role to play in guiding the board through a decision-making process. But it shouldn't just be left to the chair either. I think it's really useful if other members of the board are able to contribute in a way to ensuring that the board has a good process. And for example, sometimes if the chair is actively engaged intellectually in the nature of the decision, they lose a wee bit of track of the group process. And it may be that there are people who've got something to say who aren't able to get that say into the process, but other board members may well be able to spot that one of their colleagues really wants to speak on something, but they're not being seen by the chair. Another thing which we find is increasingly important and increasingly recognised as an important component in good board decision making is board diversity. And I touched on board composition before, but I'm thinking about it here in relation to whether or not the board culture actually values and actively seeks out a diversity of views. That can be very important. I've referred here on the screen to board process. I guess I'm thinking there about whether the board's typical process is a contest of ideas and probably therefore a contest of wills between individual members and maybe between staff and board members. And the outcome of that is almost always winners and losers, which is probably not what we want to achieve. Alternatively, is it a collaborative search for meaning and arriving at some sort of jointly agreed and committed to outcome through more of a consensus-seeking approach to the decision-making process? I'll come back and refer to that briefly later in the webinar. So, Helen, I think at that point we will pause and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Graham. We do have a question from Peter Walls in the chat box. Peter's interested in your idea that the best place for the chair is to sit in the middle of one of the long sides of the board table. He wonders, though, surely it makes Sightlines really difficult for those also sitting on that side of the table, and he feels personally frustrated with situations where the person who is chair seems embarrassed about actually taking control of the meeting. Often symbolised by the person sitting in the middle of the group. Does that make any sense to you? So, just wondering.
Yeah, look, Peter, I think that's a very valid point, and there's a bunch of trade-offs here. And when I was presenting that idea earlier on, I was talking about trying to minimise the physical distance between the chair and the members sitting around the table. But you're quite right. The sight lines to those who are sitting on the same side of the table as the chair are actually more problematic. In fact, there's an anecdote told about the particular English cabinet at the time when Maggie Thatcher first became a member of the cabinet. and the then Prime Minister, I think, was Edward Heath, and he sat in the middle of the long side of the table, and he made sure that Maggie, who was quite a protagonist of his, was sitting where he didn't have to cite her without leaning out. So he made sure that she sat on the same side of the table as him, where he could basically ignore her, and it was more difficult for her to intrude on his concentration. So, look, I don't think there's a perfect answer here other than to get away from those long tables in the first place. And, you know, in a lot of the boardrooms that I go into, the components of a board table are modular, and they can be rearranged in all sorts of different shapes. And if the shape of the room, the size of the room permits it, it's probably a good idea to look at rearranging the tables so that they might be more, if they're rectangular, in more of a square shape. And that overcomes some of that problem that you've identified.
Thanks, Graham. Does anyone else have a question for Graham at this stage? If you do, feel free to pop it into the chat box.
Okay, thanks, Helen. So I want to talk now about models of decision making, and the models aren't so as important as the need for a board to have some sort of structured and systematic approach, particularly to important decisions. There are, in the literature, and you know, some of you may have even been taught that there are a variety of different decision-making models, and I want to just introduce one model to you. I think the critical thing here, though, is simply that there is a clearly understood series of steps that a board is going to go through in making an important decision, and that those steps are clear up front. So it's important also that the management team understands the steps that the board's going to go through too, because they're obviously going to contribute at various points in the process. So here's just an illustration of what one of those structured decision-making processes might be. And I particularly want to emphasize the importance of the first step. Now, a lot of us come to board tables because in our day jobs or our past experience, we are basically problem solvers. Now, what happens, though, is that before things really get too far down the track, individual board members jump in to a conversation around the board table with solutions. But they're, in all likelihood, solutions to different definitions of the problem. So to me, it's really important to firstly be clear why the board even needs to make a decision on this particular issue, because going back to those earlier comments I made, it's quite possible that the board has already delegated quite properly that decision to someone else, and that it's created a policy framework to guide that decision such that the board would be confident it could live with the outcome of that person's or that group's decision making on its behalf. But the starting point is really for the board to be clear what problem, because decisions are usually about solving problems, or if they're not necessarily problems in a challenging sense, they are perceptions of opportunities that might exist that the organisation can take advantage of. So just before you move into later stages in the decision-making process, be sure that you're dealing with the real problem and not somebody's preferred solution to a problem, for example, has not been fully assessed and agreed. And don't stop that process too soon. There's a technique that some of you may be familiar with that I think is really useful to apply at that initial stage. And it's called the 5 whys technique, and it was developed originally by Toyota within the context of their quality improvement processes. They did a lot of statistical analysis, and they found that quality problems were very seldom solved by addressing the first statement of what the cause of the problem was. They found that they had to go through typically 5 iterations of the question why before they finally got to what the real problem actually was. So that's another reason why I said before the board needs to give itself time. It needs to think through and keep probing and keep asking until it's satisfied that it really is dealing with the real issues, rather than something that's just simply systematic. And then you go into a process which I've referred to as idea finding, but it's really a process of divergent thinking, spreading the net as wide as possible to try and generate ideas as to how that problem might be addressed. And, the ways of doing that range from asking people for their opinions, through a consultation process, through programs and explicit creativity tools and lateral thinking techniques, processes like brainstorming, for example. The important thing is not to get bogged down at that stage in evaluating those ideas, but instead concentrate on generating as many ideas as possible. Bad ideas actually often generate good ideas, so don't be too quick to judge. Try and just get as many ideas out there as possible, and then you can get into the evaluation of those and the selection of perhaps preferred options. And that's the opposite of that divergent thinking. It's where we go into a process of convergence. You may think that the best solution is obvious, but often that's not the case. And so it's important to think through the criteria that you're going to use to select the best idea. Now, I could have spent a lot of time in this webinar to the exclusion of just about anything else, talking with you about decision-making techniques and idea evaluation techniques. I had to eliminate that pretty much entirely, but some of you will be familiar with things like decision tree analysis, paired comparison analysis, which is sort of a forced choice process, grid analysis, scenario analysis. There's a whole bunch of things here which are really valuable in different contexts to assist the board to actually come to a decision on something. What I've included at the bottom of the slide here is a reference to a website where you can find really nice sort of potted descriptions and worked examples of those various techniques at work. So I can certainly commend that site to you. It's mindtools.com. I think it's based, it's a group of people based in the UK. I can certainly recommend it. There are other things that I've referred to as well, which can be quite useful at this level, and I'm not sure whether they're necessarily referred to in that MindTools website. But things like De Bono's 6 thinking hats technique, for example, and the idea of reframing, looking at things from different perspectives, and there's things like cost-benefit analysis, particularly if the cost elements in the decision are a really important part of the decision-making criteria. Then there's planning, and let's assume that you've selected an idea, you've tentatively made a decision. Then it's time to do some planning for implementation. And that sometimes can lead to further consideration of the preferred decision because, logistical issues, resourcing issues, whatever, may become significant and more apparent at that stage than perhaps they were earlier. And taking those into account, the original decision may need to be modified. So this isn't entirely a sequential, linear sort of a process. Sometimes it's important to do some doubling back. And at that point of planning, sometimes that's where staff actually need to take a much more leading role. because those that are going to implement a decision, and it will usually be staff, really have to own the decision and be confident that it's implementable. And then, the next stage obviously is to ensure that everyone who's going to be affected, or so far as possible are going to be affected, are somehow in the loop. Some great decisions being made, and then the board and the organisation have had to repent at leisure because they then met resistance from the very people that they thought they were trying to help. So I've referred to consulting, selling, modifying. There's a whole bunch of other processes that you might think are relevant as well, just to make sure that the decision is actually capable of implementation. And then the final stage is implementation, and often boards take their hands off the steering wheel at that stage and actually assume that it's all going to be plain sailing. I think boards need to generally take far more interest in the implementation, because they need to be also in a position to do something that very few boards actually do, which is to formally evaluate the quality of their decision. Decision making inevitably involves a lot of assumptions, a lot of subjective judgments, and even some of the factual material that a board might rely on often turns out to be either incorrect, or by the time the decision is implemented, things have moved on, and the context in which the decision is being implemented is different from what it was when the process started. So often there's a need for further modification, which just reinforces my comment about this needing to be a fairly iterative sort of a process. It doesn't much matter what decision-making model you use, and I'm sure you actually have probably informally already settled on something, but if not, I think make it conscious, make it quite explicit, and then work systematically through the process. I'm going to talk now and finally about some of the ways in which we might improve the quality of boardroom decision making. And some of this are things that some of you will have heard me talk about before and have been covered to some extent in earlier webinars, and certainly covered in getting on board. So for me, perhaps one of the most critical faculties for a board to be on top of is the ability to distinguish ends from means. It's really important that the board has a clear focus on defining desired outcomes, and that's not something that comes easily to governing boards. Many find it difficult, but it's an essential starting point. Too often boards fall into the trap of jumping straight into the how discussion. How are we going to do something, rather than why we're going to do something, and what is the result that we want? What's the impact we want to have? It goes back to the heart of why do we need at a board level to be making a decision on this, and what do we hope to achieve, assuming that decision is well made and well implemented. So that's the starting point in a sense. What is the outcome we want to achieve, or the impact we want to have? Then evaluate the extent to which the proposed decision will achieve that result. And then also, perhaps it's the flip side to some degree, but what are the risks involved in the proposal? And the risks usually relate to the how, but how are we going to implement a decision rather than the objectives of the decision. But if the outcome is not clear in the first place, then there's no objective basis for deciding what is the best alternative to pursue, what is the best decision. It's really important for any board to have the ability and the intent to conduct a really active and critical inquiry into a proposed decision. And that really requires the board to have the ability to ask good questions, and to a significant extent any board's real value add in its organisation is the questions that it asks. I read something once that said that most utterances in any boardroom should end in a question mark. In other words, the principal way of engaging in a board meeting should be through some form of inquiry process. Unfortunately, many of us come to the boardroom with the experience of other roles in which we've been expected to know all the answers. In the boardroom, it's far more important to know what the questions are, and that comes back to some degree to the board's composition that I referred to earlier. Do we understand enough about the organisation and its operating environment to ask the right sort of questions? It doesn't mean, though, that every member of the board should be some sort of subject matter expert which is relevant to the organisation's function. There's actually incredible value in what some people loosely call dumb questions, but I refer to them as, and prefer to refer to them as intelligently naive questions. Somebody who is not steeped in the culture of the organisation, is not highly familiar with what it does, can ask questions that those who are more or better acquainted with the organisation can't, because they're simply too close to it. They've become to some degree institutionalised. So that's why increasingly boards are giving themselves, organisations are giving themselves the capability of appointing people to their boards simply because they are outsiders in a sense. So I would certainly suggest that in a decision-making context, the board values the role of the naive inquirer. That's, some of you may have been involved in professions. For example, I have a daughter who is a nurse, and that is a role that as part of their training they're encouraged to learn to do, so that in an operating theatre when it looks like the surgeon is going to cut off the wrong leg, then somebody's going to pipe up and say, are we doing the right thing here? Earlier on, I was hinting at the way in which the board engages. Is it the sort of culture where there is a contest going on inside the board, where individual board members are seeking to impose their will and their thinking on the board, or is it more of a collaborative process? And I can sum that up in the dichotomy between a board that typically involves itself in a sense a formal type of debate, which is quite contentious. It seeks to oppose various thoughts that are expressed by others, to become argumentative, and even perhaps, according to a dictionary definition, to fight or quarrel. We've probably all seen that to some degree or other in various decision-making groups that we've been involved in. So I guess my message here is that I don't think that style of discourse is very productive in a boardroom. It results in winners and losers. It weakens a board's commitment to a decision, and it often simply results in downstream attempts at re-litigation or even active undermining of the board's decision. And we see that most often in highly politicized environments, and I'm sure that people can think about examples of that you may have seen. So I am much more in favour of a board thinking about conducting its decision-making discourse as what in the literature is referred to as a dialogue. And that's essentially a collaborative process. It's a conversation. It's an exchange of ideas, a respectful exchange of ideas, where there is a premium on listening and trying to understand. In a debate situation, we are listening, but we're mainly listening just to pick holes in somebody else's argument and position ourselves to win a point. So a dialogue process is about a group of people who seek mutual understanding and agreement on common ground. So it's inquisitive rather than argumentative. And I tend to think of it as like a jigsaw puzzle, really, and that each member of the board has a piece of that jigsaw, and they need to collaborate to put the picture together. And it also means that each member of the board's views are valued because they bring a unique perspective and a unique set of information and ideas to that collaborative process. Also, a dialogue style of operation is much more consistent with the sort of holistic system style of thinking which is essential at the board level of an organisation, that sort of big picture helicopter view of things. It's also interesting that the literature around dialogue points to the fact that breakthroughs in science and group discussion often come from being open to the sort of flow. In fact, the origins, the base of the word dialogue is the flow of meaning is what it refers to. And so it's about trying to create a flow of meaning of the collective wisdom, if you like, of the group, the larger intelligence of the group, and taking advantage of that. Another thing that is also quite useful to think about in a board decision-making context is ensuring, going back to that comment I made earlier on about the divergent thinking front end of decision-making processes, broadening the base of the options which are open. There's a commonly referred to style of thinking which is both and, rather than either or. It's both of those options and something else. So just about continuing on, don't just get caught in that sort of bipolar kind of either this or that, which really is narrowing the options that are open to the board. I also mentioned framing earlier on. I want to talk about this specifically because the board is probably the most important leadership group in an organisation, although leadership and boards are often not terms that are used in the same sentence, which is a shame really, because the board has the ultimate accountability for the performance of the organisation. And when it's in that sort of inevitable or unavoidable leadership mode, even if it abrogates leadership role, I think we need to be quite conscious, more conscious than we probably are as board members, about the language that we use. And framing is all about language because it is about managing the meaning around a particular board discussion or dialogue. Framing, again, a definition of that is framing is about a quality of communication that causes others to accept one meaning over another meaning. So frames are influential not only through what they highlight, but also through what they leave out. And often the way we frame a situation is unconscious, but it can also be a deliberate psychological device that highlights what we as a persuader want others to see, and it blocks out what we don't want our colleagues to see about something. Some of you may have seen, I chose not to watch it, but I noticed it was a TV program last night about the O.J. Simpson case, which never seems to go away. Apparently jurors were instructed to discover whether or not O.J. Simpson had murdered his wife, but the lawyers for both sides immediately reframed that differently. So the prosecution framed the whole situation as a male wife beater versus a female victim. In contrast, the defence lawyers framed the case as an ethnic minority victim versus a racist police force. And you can see how those different frames would lead to the production of quite different forms of advocacy on the part of the prosecution in the defence. Of course, the jury at the time accepted the defence frame, but there are other parties who've never accepted the outcome of that case, and so that's, I think, why it won't go away. Another way of thinking about framing or using framing is to try and conduct a series of discussions from the perspectives of different stakeholders. You can imagine that a funder, like Creative New Zealand, for example, or a community trust, or whatever it might be, a philanthropist, the way they would look at what you do and what you're trying to achieve might be quite differently from the way your staff look at it, or the way your patrons might look at it. So sort of stepping into the shoes of those different groups is another good way of forcing yourselves at a decision-making level to look at things from different perspectives. There are a bunch of decision-making dangers, and some of these were touched on in the most recent webinar we did before, which was late last year, which addressed things like board dynamics. So I don't want to go back through that, but I'd refer you back to that particular webinar. But you know, it's really important that the board recognises that groups have various cognitive shortcomings, limitations that can easily impact on the quality of decision making. So, for example, groupthink, which is probably widely referred to, is where a board ends up examining too few alternatives. There is a tendency that the benefits will be exaggerated and the risks will be minimised, that possible solutions, alternative solutions, will be dropped off too quickly, that there's no real testing of solutions as they emerge, because the essence of groupthink is about the social pressures within a group to conform. And often that's conforming to, say, a board leader or some other dominant force, and recognises that actually quite often members of the board really value the membership of the group and don't want to do anything to upset their colleagues. Another cognitive shortcoming is what's called shared information bias. Obviously, a group of board members will pool or can pool their individual knowledge and expertise, but there's a tendency in that situation for groups to spend too much time examining information that people around the board table know in common. It's shared information, and it creates a feeling of comfort in the sense that the group feels more that it's working towards a consensus agreement because they do have that shared information. They're not consciously bringing into the mix information that they don't have and which may challenge their assumptions and their preferences. Pluralistic ignorance, which is a great phrase, exists where members of a board hold varied opinions or beliefs but don't express them because they mistakenly believe that their personal views would be inconsistent with the opinions of others in the group. So that's another form, if you like, of that group think, or leads to it. But it prompts people to conform to group norms that actually don't exist except in their own minds. And it stems from the natural human tendencies both to overestimate the extent to which their views differ from group norms and for them to want to be seen as a cooperative member of the group. Obviously, not having the right information is a serious deficiency in any decision-making process. And you know, it also means that the natural tendency for negative information to overwhelm positive information is more pronounced. So it's really important to test whether you think you've got the right information. And sometimes boards simply have to make decisions, say in emergencies, when they don't have all the information that they would like to have. Inadequate implementation, I referred to before. It's really important for boards to remain vigilant after they've made their decisions. And even just to make sure that their decisions are clearly stated, and that's not always the case. I've seen a number of situations where people have left boardrooms thinking that they've made a clear decision, but in fact around the board table there are quite different interpretations of that decision and further interpretations within the management team. They're the ones that are going to have to make implementation happen. And finally, evaluating and learning from past decisions is really important. I referred to this before. Did we make correct assumptions? Did we have the right information that we needed? And almost more important than anything else, because once the decision's made, the milk is spilt in a sense. But what did we learn from that decision and the way we approached it? How might we do better another time? So finally, I just want to leave you with this thought from Henry Kissinger, which I came across recently. He was talking about public service and high office and the importance of what you learn in a decision-making context. But I've highlighted the bit that really stood out for me. You can learn to make decisions, and that's a lot of what I've been talking about this morning. But the really critical thing, and this is where a board comes into its own, is knowing what decisions to make. Helen, I think we can, certainly I've concluded my presentation at that point, but I'm very happy to take any final questions.
Great, thanks Graham. We do have a question from Murray Claude. He says, a common issue I have experienced is the board spends most of the time looking backwards, financial reports as a beauty, and not spending much time on where we're going. Your comments on this?
Yeah, look, it's, I'd say it's almost a cliche, but it's certainly a truism to say that a board cannot influence anything that's already happened. So, in other words, the board should spend the bulk of its time facing the future and thinking about what it can do rather than fretting over past decisions and spending an inordinate amount of time tracking, the financials and that sort of thing. Obviously, that's important to make sure that the organisation's on track. But actually where the board's value added is in its collective intelligence, its collective wisdom, and its ability to think things through which haven't yet happened and influence them. And that's in terms of what is it that we want to achieve and what are the situations and circumstances that we want to avoid. So that's the risk management dimension, if you like, to the decision-making process. So it comes back to me to the board's ability to apply itself to planning. I talked about annual agendas early in the webinar, and that's about getting decisions, identifying decisions that need to be made through the year, the critical ones. One of the things the board needs to get on top of, what order should they be dealt with, and ideally when in terms of future meetings. And then within the meeting, making sure that those decisions are actually dealt with early on in the piece. Too many board agendas get cluttered up with the sorts of things that Murray's talking about. Spend, the greater part, the better part of the board meeting reviewing past performance and getting bogged down in that as opposed to facing the future.
Thanks, Graham. We're just about up in terms of time, so if anyone else does have a question on today's session, feel free to email myself or